Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of A Mic on the Podium with me, Michael Seal. Today, I conduct a conversation with a Canadian conductor who grew up in Trinidad and was educated in the United Kingdom. He's held positions in both Germany and France, as well as having a highly successful career as a guest conductor all across the world. It's a great pleasure to welcome Kwamé Ryan. Kwamé, it is very nice to meet you. Well, I'll say meet you. I did play for you a long time ago, but to see you and to speak with you, how are you?
Very well, thank you, Michael, and thanks very much for having me on.
Not a problem at all. Regular listeners will know I always go straight to the very beginning of your life and find out how music first came into your world. I mean, I use Wikipedia and also your website to know that you were born in Canada, but then grew up in Trinidad, schooled in England, and a university education in England and Switzerland. But when did music come into your life? Musical parents, musical family? How did it start?
Well, absolutely no musical family members for a start. I come from a family of academics. Mm-hmm. My dad is a political scientist, a journalist, an author. My mom is English teacher, but also part-time an actress. So I did grow up in the theater. So that's definitely part of my upbringing. But music came into our family home really through my parents' record collection. They're both avid music lovers, and my mom in particular had a very large classical music vinyl collection, which was my playground for the early years of my musical exposure. And that was, the route through which I was able to discover a lot of the music that I came to love later on.
And were there any LPs or, cassettes or whatever you were listening to, CDs possibly, I don't know how old you are, that inspired you to take up an instrument in any regard?
No, to be honest, I zeroed in at a very young age on the stick waving. So as you rightly research, I grew up on the island of Trinidad, but my parents went to university in Canada, and for that reason, they had a lot of friends in North America. And one of the things that they did with myself and my sister in the summer holidays was to return to Toronto in particular, or to Ontario in general, to spend Christmas and summer holidays. And so it was on one of those summer holidays that we went to an open air concert at a place called Ontario Place. And I saw, I think it was the Toronto Symphony with Ozawa. And it was the first time I had seen a symphony orchestra, and I was just blown away. And I reportedly, I don't really recall this, but my mom says that I leaned over and said, I want to do what the guy in the middle is doing. and I was probably 6 at the time. And so it wasn't really that I wanted to play an instrument, but of course my mom then said, well, before you can do that, you're going to need to play an instrument. And so when we got back home from that summer holiday, the first thing that happened was that a piano was procured, and I started having piano lessons.
Brilliant. It's funny. On a few occasions during the over 100 episodes of the podcast, somebody said a similar story. They've seen somebody early on, either live like you, or even on the television. I've had, I want to do that, Mum, or I want to do that, Dad. Before they've even played an instrument, which is very rare. I mean, I went an awful long way. I mean, I became a professional violinist before I even thought about doing that. I wasn't interested at all. I mean, I had to, because I did composition, but, I didn't really enjoy it until much later. So the piano becomes your thing, and you move to the UK to study at Oakham School, and then on to Cambridge, where I think you read musicology. Is that right? Or music?
Yes, that's right. I mean, there was something important in between, which was that you say that the piano was my thing, but I would never, ever characterize the piano as my thing. The piano was a tool. The piano was nothing more than a tool. And although I got quite advanced as a pianist, ended up, actually playing concertos and whatnot at school, it was something that I never really enjoyed. Unfortunately, while I was at Oakham School, I took up the double bass. I had been a violinist before and was switched to the double bass when I got to England, because they said, we don't need any more violinists, we need double bassists, my friend.
Don't we all? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was either that
you have no choice.
Yeah.
I actually wanted to play cello, but I wasn't allowed to do that either.
Right.
So I learned the double bass and joined, I make it sound very simple, but after a couple of years on the double bass, was accepted into the National Youth Orchestra of Great Britain. And that was the way that I ended up really starting to get in contact with conducting. I was allowed to conduct National Youth Orchestra several times while I was in it, which was a great privilege. And so by the time I got to Cambridge, I already was really full on conducting. I saw myself as a conductor, but first studied double bass even before piano, to be honest.
So you're another bass player. Another Michael Francis, I think, is the only other bass player I've spoken to. I think over the whole of the podcast episodes. Oh, that's wonderful.
I think Zubin Mehta's a double bassist as well.
Yeah, but sadly he said no when I asked him, so he's not on the list.
I'm sorry, Michael.
It's fine. You know, over the course of the next few episodes, maybe I'll start outing a few more people who said no over the last 2 years. But that's interesting about the National Youth Orchestra, because I mean, much later on we'll come back to it, because you've since gone back and conducted them on occasion. Who was conducting when you were in the National Youth Orchestra? Because these are such important days. Again, we'll come back to youth orchestras later on. Your first encounter with a pro conductor, somebody, you know, a big name who comes in maybe halfway through the course. Somebody else has done the donkey work for them beforehand, and then in they come. So who conducted when you were in the National Youth Orchestra?
Yeah. Well, the most enduring memory I have of that sort of starstruck experience was actually Mark Elder, who came in to do the third act of The Valkyrie with us, with Dame Gwyneth Jones and Simon Estes, if you please.
Yeah, wow, yeah.
And then a whole host of Valkyries. I mean, it was mind-blowing.
Yeah.
And he was actually really, really good to me. He, talked to me about conducting. I was allowed to conduct on the course that he did. It was a prom, actually, which was all the more sort of awe-inspiring. And then another course that kind of sort of stuck in my memory was one that Matthias Bammert did. Just, watching at my age, watching somebody who's as technically proficient as Matthias do his thing on a really complicated program of Ives and Copland Symphony No. 3, and that also kind of blew my mind. So, at that impressionable age, to be able to actually go up to these guys and say, I want to do what you do, can you help me, was just such a privilege, and something that I have tried as a professional to facilitate for sort of up and coming conductors, because I just know the power of being able to interface with a professional at a young age. It can make the most enormous difference.
You couldn't have picked two nicer people. They both come on the podcast, and I've met Mark, and Matthias Bammert was wonderful. Really, really funny raconteur, lovely stories about growing up and conducting. So I'm not surprised that they helped you, and I'm not surprised that they put an arm around you and gave you some advice. I mean, I'm looking at a list of mentors that are across various places where I've done my homework. Sir Mark Elder is mentioned, but also Lynn Binstock, Peter Ertversch, who I know you went to study with quite seriously, and another name I don't know, Lothar Zagraszek, if that's how it's pronounced.
Yeah.
I mean,
Zagraszek.
Zagraszek. Okay. Of all of those, do you think there's one in particular that you could say, was the primary conducting teacher in your studies? Late teens, early 20s.
Without a shadow of a doubt, it was Peter Ertversch. I went straight out of the last year at Cambridge to the International Bartok Festival in Saint-Martin. I was recommended to do that by Julian Anderson, who was a contemporary of mine at Keys, Cambridge. For those who don't know who Julian is, he's just one of the great British composers.
That's
sort
right.
of
Yes.
Thomas Addis's generation.
Yeah.
And Julian, I was talking to Julian at college, and I said, I want to do Bartok's Bluebeard's Castle. I want to do it as my final concert. There was a tradition at the time in Cambridge that if you were one of the conductors of the University Music Society Orchestra, you got to do a big concert to which you could invite agents and producers to come and see you work. And I wanted to do this one-act opera by Bartok. And Julian said, if you want to do that, the best way to learn it is to go work with Peter Oetfisch in Szombathy. He's doing it this summer. And so I auditioned for Szombathy, met Peter, and he just kind of turned my musical world upside down, because he had this sort of composer's, conductor's approach to music, which was at once the technical side of it, but also that fascination with sound and the different ways of generating and manipulating sound that a composer has. And he just revolutionized my ears in the 2 weeks that I spent working with him. And I was so excited by that I wanted to continue working with him, which I then did for what would become the next 6-7 years, not only in Budapest, but also in Karlsruhe in Germany. And then I sort of became a member of his conducting institute, and we stayed together for quite some time. I premiered some of his operas in Germany, and he was a really sort of key personality in my musical development overall.
Well, he's not come up as a name of a teacher on this podcast. It's a regular thing that if it's a name I don't know, it sounds like you've alluded to the fact that he was very much into the timbres and the colors and the sounds, as a composer would be, and also technically, maybe down to the fact that, he's known for conducting a lot of contemporary music, which technically you have to be really have the chops for. So an overall holistic approach. He was also very good at sort of learning and assimilating a score and telling you how to do that as well.
Absolutely. So Peter was the one that said to me at this early stage, when I hadn't even considered contemporary music as something I'd be interested in. I mean, I mentioned Julian Anderson as one of the great living British composers, but Julian's music wasn't on my radar at all. Neither was Tom Addis's music. I knew they were composing, but I was really into my Puccini and my Mozart and my Britten, if we wanted to come as up to date as I was at that time. And then Peter said, do you know, you actually have a facility, you have a technical facility that would open the door for you to contemporary music. And I was like, really? And he said, yeah, absolutely. And then he sort of put his money where his mouth was. He invited me to conduct one piece at György Kurtág's 60th birthday concert in Stuttgart, Germany. It was a sort of it was a portrait concert, and there were so many pieces he couldn't conduct them all. And so he said, you come to this one piece. And I did it. And of course, Musical Europe was assembled in the audience. All the agents, all the orchestra managers were coming to celebrate Kurtág. And I just happened to do this one piece. And literally after the concert was over, I was sitting with orchestra managers discussing dates for when I could come and work with their ensembles or with their orchestras. And the next thing I knew, I was a contemporary music specialist.
Well, what immediately springs to my mind is that sounds like you've won a competition without having to go through any of the earlier rounds, and it was only you in the final. That sounds wonderful.
It was definitely a slipstream. It was a wormhole.
Well, to get all of those people in the room and you go out there and do a wonderful job, and then suddenly now you're filling your diary up, and I'm assuming. Would that be also when you picked up a manager or started chatting to managers?
That came a couple of years later. I mean, what happened next was that Ensemble Recherche, one of the musicians from Ensemble Recherche, which is one of the great German contemporary music ensembles, was playing in the orchestra.
Hmm.
And he mentioned me to the ensemble, and they kind of filled my diary up with appearances at all the major contemporary music festivals with them. I recorded with them. I was with Ensemble Recherche as the sort of core of my sort of early career for several years. And it ended up being about 5 years during which I was really exclusively conducting contemporary music, be it with Klangforum Wien or with Ensemble Moderne, or with Recherche, with Orangenfabrik. There were just a lot of ensembles that became aware of me. And that sounds like exactly what every conductor wants, but I come back to the fact that I had been into my Puccini and my Bartok and my Mozart, and I didn't see myself that way. It was a wonderful education and a trip to be on these big stages, you know, at that age.
You've read my mind, because my question was going to be, well, who was it then who took the plunge? Because the first thing the next bullet point on my notebook, dear listener, is 99 to 03. Kwamé becomes the GMD, or the general music director of the Freiburg Opera and the Freiburg Philharmonic Orchestra. So who was it? Was it Freiburg? But who was it who suddenly said, well, you know, I'm sure you can do contemporary music, Kwamé, but why don't you come and conduct a Strauss tone poem? Or why don't you come and conduct a Mozart piano concerto and a Brahms symphony? How did you not get out of, because that sounds like you didn't want to do it, but how did you start moving away from contemporary music?
Well, what happened was, after I'd been in the contemporary music drawer for a little while, I thought, as you mentioned, I'm going to need an agent, because, you know, the diary's getting quite full. I'm going to need help. So I wrote to 10 agencies, and I just wrote one of those crazy letters that I understand artists sometimes write. Here I am. This is what I've been doing. Would you like to manage me? And of the 10, I got an answer from one. And that one was a gentleman called Jürgen Erlebach, who was a pretty big conductor agent in Hamburg, Germany. He had a big roster of conductors, almost exclusively conductors, one of whom, by the way, was Lothar Zagosek. And Lothar Zagosek was at the time the general music director of the Stuttgart Opera, which was in its heyday. It was the opera house of the year, a year after year after year after year, under Zagosek and his partner, his working partner, Zählein. And it was Jürgen Erlebach that put Lothar Zagosek and me together. Lothar was doing Bluebeard's Castle, here it is again, at La Monnaie, which is Belgian National Opera. And he said, I've got this new young conductor on my roster. I'd like him to be your assistant in Belgium, if you don't mind. And Lothar said, sure, send him along. And I assisted Lothar when he left after his first 4 performances. I did 4 performances. And that was kind of a big deal, you know. So Lothar said, okay, so you can do opera. You know what? I'm going to put you up for the general music director position in Freiburg. You won't get it. You have no chance. but the experience will do you good. You'll be washed in the waters. You'll walk through the fire, and you'll come out, you know, better for it. Fast forward 9 months. I've done the interview. I've done the first audition. I've done the second audition, which was a completely crazy affair.
Right.
Listen to what the audition was. The final audition for this job was, you do a Friday evening performance of Verdi's Otello with no rehearsal. With no rehearsal, because rehearsal is cheating.
Yes, of course it is. Of course,
No rehearsal. So I'd never conducted it before. I learned it for that audition performance, and I went in the pit in front of a paying audience on a Friday night and conducted Verdi Otello.
Yeah.
And the next thing I knew, I was a general music director, the youngest general music director of a German opera house there had been at the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
At 28. And yeah, that was like a major, major shift in my life, just to go from full-on contemporary music with all that's associated with that professionally to being in a regional, albeit a large regional, but still a regional repertoire opera house in Germany. And for those of your audience that don't know what repertoire house means, it means that the house is doing one opera tonight, another opera the next night, another opera the night before, and goes on like that in a cycle. So it's not 3 weeks of the same opera where you could get some rhythm. It's repertoire. So just one thing after another with constant changes. And that was definitely in the deep end.
Yeah. So yeah, you could have Monday night is Marriage of Figaro, Tuesday night is Otello, Wednesday night is Wozzeck, back to Marriage of Figaro on Thursday. Friday could be, whatever, like a bit of light operetta. And you're expected to conduct many of those as the GMD. The phrase GMD has appeared, it's sort of popped up regularly, fairly regularly throughout the 100 or so episodes. And the reason why I bring it up is because of the experience of Jack van Steen, the Dutch conductor, who frankly told me in episode 3 he hated being a general music director in Weimar because he soon realized that he was going to be spending 75% of his time in meetings and 25% actually conducting. Whereas Kirill Karabits didn't seem to mind it. He had exactly the same job after Jack, and others have been sort of meh about the whole thing. How did you find it? Were you embroiled in lots of meetings? How did you find suddenly, you're now the boss, and you're probably having to learn 2 or 3 operas, or all the operas that are sent at you? How did you find it all?
Well, I mean, you've alluded to one of the key things, which was I had to learn everything I was doing there from scratch. I was coming to that with literally 3 operas under my belt, and having to conduct 3 or 4 per season.
Yeah.
And because of the reputation I had come to Freiburg with, which was that of a contemporary music specialist.
Yes.
I was doing a contemporary opera within those 3 or 4 operas every year.
Yeah.
So that was really, really daunting. And I mean, you talk about Wozzeck one night, Marriage of Figaro the next night, Tosca the next night, but what you haven't said yet is that what can happen is that you have a 2 or 3 week break between one Wozzeck and the next Wozzeck, where the orchestra hasn't seen it. You haven't had the thing in your hands, and you need to come back in front of a paying audience and do it like you did it yesterday.
Yeah.
And this was for someone who was pretty darn green. I was still in my 20s, but also someone who had been raised in stagione, which is the other system where you play just one opera for a full run of 2 weeks. You do 7 performances, 8 performances, and then it's done. I'd been musically raised that way. For someone who's raised in that system, this repertoire thing was quite traumatic.
Yeah, I was going to say,
it was just traumatic because I always felt like we weren't doing the work that we had done after the premiere justice a month later, having not seen the piece for a long time and had other pieces interspersed and symphony concerts, and it was just a routine that I didn't have. But I tell you something, my erstwhile agent was right. I was, after those 4 years, definitely washed in all the waters and had walked through all the fire. And there was like nothing that could faze me after that, because like my second performance of Tosca, which was the opera I opened with, the tenor got sick and dropped out, and I never saw him again because he got really sick. And I had a different Cavaradossi almost at every performance after that. So I was coming to the opera house. Good evening. This is your Cavaradossi for tonight's performance, maestro. I was like, how do you do? Shall we run through it?
Yeah.
And then the next thing you know, you're playing for people who are paying good money and dealing with it. So it was trying, but it was the most unbelievably good training for dealing with everything that musical theatre can throw at you.
I mean, part of your job there was you also had to conduct the Freiburg Philharmonic Orchestra, which I'm assuming was basically the same orchestra as the opera orchestra. That the two, they had a dual role. I'm assuming also that your 6 years spent at the National Orchestra of Bordeaux Aquitaine were an awful lot easier than they were. That you were just running a symphony program, but you were guesting, and you still go and do opera. Or your name appears if I look at the places you guested. It's a pretty happy mixture of opera houses and symphony orchestras. I want to touch on guesting because it's something that we all have to do. I mean, I don't suppose we all have to do it. I'm sure that the people at the very top of the tree can pick and choose it, and they never have to go and conduct a new orchestra again. But we do need to go and guest. Do you have any strategies, any tactics, any programs that you like to take as your first program, if given the choice? I mean, sometimes we're not, are we? We're just asked, would you mind coming and conducting the New World Symphony, with this concerto? Now, what's guesting like for you? And that magic / frightening moment when you put a downbeat down and you have no idea what's going to come back, or when, or what.
All of this is very pertinent.
Yeah.
First of all, I've been very fortunate to have pretty reliably throughout my career been given the choice of what I wanted to conduct when I went to guest.
That's good.
That it helped that I had really good agents who brokered those things for me.
Yeah.
And so I was always pretty comfortable with the repertoire I was conducting. You're right about the question of when an orchestra is going to play after the downbeat, because you conduct a British orchestra and you will get playing on the downbeat, right on it. You conduct an orchestra maybe in Hungary or in Eastern Europe somewhere, and you could be waiting a half a second. They all play beautifully together, but you have to get used to the fact that they might play a little bit later than another orchestra. And that, I have to confess, as a contemporary music specialist, that's something I've never gotten used to. I like it to be on. But otherwise, the major thing that I think has stuck with me about guesting was the difference between guesting in Europe and guesting in North America. And the major thing is the amount of rehearsal you get. So a European orchestra, you could expect to have, anywhere between 3 and 5 rehearsals.
Yes, that's right.
Many North American orchestras, you can expect 2. And for a big symphonic program, 2 and a general. And other orchestras, some London orchestras, you might even be underway with 1 and a general.
And sometimes just a general. that's also known as well.
Indeed. But as uneasy as I was with that at the beginning, I found that I actually enjoyed working faster more than I enjoyed having lots and lots of time. Simply because rehearsal is for me just a rite of passage. It's just organization and pacts and covenants and agreements, and I want to get through that as expeditiously as I can to that moment where we're actually doing something spontaneous on a stage together. And so I've really, really enjoyed guesting in the US for that reason. I love the speed and the pressure. I kind of thrive on that.
Well, I'm going to take that one step further then, because it sounds like you're like me in the fact that I love an air of spontaneity where it's possible in a program. You know, when you go out there over an evening, and I've said to an orchestra, they've asked me, "Are you going to do that crescendo there? Because you did a diminuendo the last time." I said, "Well, I don't know until I get there in the concert. We'll find out." You know, do you have any strategies for getting across to an orchestra in a short space of time? Hey, I'm somebody who loves spontaneity. Do you know what I mean? Because some orchestras love everything, the I's dotted, the T's crossed, underlining here. This is exactly how we're going to turn that corner. It's going to be the same writ every single time. Other orchestras are just waiting and watching and going with it. Do you have any strategies, or any? Do you like to get that out there early on in the process?
Well, it depends on what I'm doing. Obviously, if it's contemporary music, you're dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's, and you're delivering everything the way that it's been prepared in the rehearsals. With standard repertoire, frankly, I tend to be pretty reliable with what I want going in and coming out, but obviously, the less rehearsal you have, the more, first of all, you need to go in to it with a pretty strong idea of what you want.
Yeah.
And by the same token, I found that, and this is going to seem paradoxical, the stronger the idea that I have going in, the more flexible I feel when I'm actually standing there. It's like I can let go of plans more easily the clearer they are. Whereas if I'm not so sure of where we're going with this, I find myself feeling more stressed and perhaps less flexible as a result. It's a weird kind of mirror universe that I exist in, and I'm sure that many of my colleagues would understand that. Musical theater is different from symphonic conducting. Musical theater, there are too many moving parts for you to really shock people with spontaneity. Because it's not just the orchestra. There's a singer, and there's someone pulling a rope on the side of the stage, and someone, turning on a light and changing a costume. And if they had 5 seconds to change it where they thought they were going to have 20, you're not a good person.
No. I was definitely speaking in symphonic terms. I mean, just to finish on that topic, I suppose also the thing that needs to be said is that if the rehearsal process time is squashed, then the orchestra are actually going to be watching you harder than if they know they've got 2 or 3 days. So therefore, they're looking for cues. The analogy I gave to somebody who was not a professional soloist, I won't go into the full story because it takes too long, but he was a very, very able pianist, and he'd given himself a year to play the Grieg Piano Concerto for a TV documentary. And he came along as soloist, and we were rehearsing it. And he kept saying to me, "But the orchestra are following me so well." And I said, "Well, can I give you the following metaphor? This orchestra is like a racing driver behind a car, and it's driving the same race course every time they get to the Grieg Piano Concerto. They know where all the corners are. They just need to discover whether you're going to go around it in 3rd gear or 4th gear. That's all. But they know that you're going to go around in 3rd or 4th. If you go around it in 1st, then there might be a problem. But if they know the circuit, they know the shape of the course, so they know where all the problems are. So they're listening for you. And it's the same. You squash the amount of rehearsal time down, they're going to be looking at you all of the time in all of the same places, aren't they? As a conductor, they're going to be looking at you for the writ. Are you going to do that traditional pause there? How are you going to cope with those corners?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And then conducting becomes, for me, what it is in its essence, which is a gestural language which translates a musical language, or somehow manipulates a musical idiom. And then you don't have to speak anymore. And I mean, that was like the bane of my early years as a conductor. I just had this idea, perhaps from having been deeply impressed by my experience in youth orchestras. I thought this idea that you had to speak as a conductor, because of course at youth orchestras, conductors do talk because they have lots of young people that they need to keep entertained. A professional orchestra is not looking for that. And it took me like a couple of years at the beginning of my career to understand that I could rely on my gestural prowess and just shut up, and it would be so much more fun for me and for everybody else. So I really lean into that now, and it is much more enjoyable. But I will say that I do enjoy, for for the sort of reverse reason, going to an orchestra with complicated contemporary repertoire, because
Yes.
I do enjoy being the person in the room, like the only person in the room that does know all the corners
Yeah.
at the outset.
Yes. Yeah.
And being able to mold something from that point of view, where you're the advocate of a composer and you're representing a composer with an orchestra, that's a very enjoyable experience as well.
Well, I'm going to stick with the analogy.
It's an experience that has more discovery in it, you know.
Yes.
There's a different type of discovery in it for everybody.
I'm going to stick with the analogy and go one step further, because let's go back, and you mentioned you remember the National Youth Orchestra of Great Britain, and I know that you've conducted them, and the National Youth Orchestra of France, I believe, as well. Which means that you've now got a third role, is you not only do you know where all the corners are, but now you've got to teach them how to go round the corners, which means you do have to talk a bit more. What is it about youth orchestras you enjoy? I know what I enjoy when I conduct youth orchestras, and I still do. I conduct the CBSO's own youth orchestra. But what do you enjoy about it?
I think of course, on a somewhat selfish level, I enjoy the nostalgia of it, just for myself.
I bet.
You know, there's a closure, there's a type of closure that one gets when one's played in an orchestra like that, and then stood in front of one like that as a professional. That just feels right for me, because I do enjoy teaching and communicating. But from the music making point of view, I just love the freshness that youth orchestras bring to their approach to a piece. Is that, like, they're not jaded, they don't know all the corners, but they're open to possibilities that might not have been that might not be conventional. And they're also willing to dig in to things that a professional orchestra might gloss over, because they know, well, you know, this is how we do that.
Yes.
You don't need to dig into that. I remember, for example, when Mark came to NYOGB with Valkyrie, the fire music at the end of Die Walküre Act 3, he rehearsed that in the most brutal detail, but to the point. But no, seriously, it was like every note in those quick violin passages became audible, and the way the chords move and this glassy precision that's on the page, when you actually play it after 2.5 weeks of rehearsal with, you know, wide-eyed teenagers who are athletic in their left hands, it sounds incredible. It's a revelation, and that kind of opportunity to reveal things in old repertoire that you think you know is the gift of working with a really good youth orchestra. Yeah.
Oh, I agree. And having once had to play the Magic Fire music at the end of Die Walküre, one on a part because it was a reduced orchestration, I feel for those kids, because that's one of the hardest things I've ever had to play.
It was brutal, but it was fun.
Yeah, but I mean, on a serious note, at that age, nobody said to them, "Oh, look, it's just an effect. Just get as many notes as you can." You know, they're trying their collective skins, arses, balls off to try and play every single note and do what Mark's asking about, you know, color, tone, whatever, dynamic, balance. So yeah, I can imagine it was exciting. And whilst we're on the subject of scores, there is an 11th question, Kwame, which I haven't told you about, but every conductor has answered it, because every conductor has to go through this. It's to do with marking up scores. Don't worry, it's not a frightening one. When you come to mark up a score, do you have a system that you like to use? You know, start at page 1, work your way through, or flick through it and go sort of big to small? Do you use a piano at all? And for the real geek students, and myself in particular, are you a scribbler in of notation? Are you a red, blue, black colours with highlighters, or are you somebody who just doesn't use anything at all and keeps it all nice and clean? How do you go about learning a score?
Well, it depends to a certain extent what kind of score it is, but my approach to score marking is something that I've kind of inherited from Peter Oetfisch, because of the complexity of the repertoire that he introduced me to.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
So yes, I use a lot of colors
Yeah.
when I'm doing a contemporary score. And in fact, I always start by marking the dynamics. So I have a color which is assigned to each dynamic,
Okay.
and a type. So forte is red, fortissimo is red but has a different shape. Mezzo forte has its yellow. Piano has its own shade of blue. Pianissimo has another shade of blue. And what I do this because in a contemporary score, when you can see like a heat map of dynamics through the score, you have an understanding of so many things with regard to structure, with regard to shape, balance, priority, color. You can literally see the mixtures on the page when you look at it, you know, in this sort of it's like a heat map. It's like a radiation map reveal.
Yeah.
So I always start with that. Then I look at the rhythms. I go through everything that's time-based, be it bar numbers or actual rhythms where things coincide. If it's complex, I actually put lines through things so I can see where they coincide. You can hear the contemporary music shining through this, obviously.
Absolutely,
I don't do this for Beethoven. I don't do this for Mozart. But because I've spent so much of my career doing complicated scores, that's my process. The dynamics, then everything that's time-based, and then really everything else. So I actually end up coming to the context for the music, the story, any history, any compositional, peculiarities that I need to be aware of. I do that all at the end once I've absorbed the score in its detail, sort of taken it apart. And the other thing I do, which is a little peculiar, but I recently learned that I'm not the only crazy person who does things like this. For contemporary opera, I will actually do, especially if it's a world premiere or work that's never been heard before, I'll actually do a full mock-up of the score in Logic. So that means I'll be using sample libraries.
Yeah.
I'm a big Spitfire audio fan, if you know what that is.
I don't, but I can imagine.
And basically, so Logic is a sequencer. It's a piece of software that you can assign events to in MIDI, and every event is a note. Yeah. And then you can assign that event to an instrumental sample so that event will trigger the sound of an actual violin playing, an actual oboe playing at a certain dynamic, and literally you create an orchestral mock-up of what it's going to sound like. Now, that sounds crazy, but what you can do once you have that mock-up, and this is, by the way a lot of film scores are mocked up, is you can go and rehearse on your own. So you can go and say, that's actually how this mixture is going to sound. I think let me try it with some more violin, or let me try it with a harder attack on the oboes. And you literally program it into the computer, and you hear that and you say, okay, that works, but it needs to be faster than the composer's written. So let me try it 5 metronome marks faster. And then the computer will play it for you. And then I go and I sing all the vocal parts over the top. Yeah. So I sing all the parts. So I've got what ends up being like a CD production of myself performing the whole opera. So that by the time I get to the first rehearsal, I've played every part in the orchestra. I've sung every part on stage. And as I said before, it allows me, with that detailed knowledge, to let go of all of that and say, okay, now tabula rasa, what are the artists that I'm working with interested in doing with this? Yeah. But I always have in the background a version of it that I know will work, and I can let it go. Yeah. Or I can say, here's what I tried. Here's what I've done in the lab. Let's try this. Yeah. And if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But having something super specific like that is, for contemporary opera, really useful. And against every instinct that I've ever had, I've found that singers actually appreciate having a real close look into what the conductor has imagined
Yeah.
a month before they get to the rehearsal.
I bet, yeah. And I can also imagine the composer being very happy because you're almost, well, you are proofreading everything as you're inputting it into Logic and Spitfire, and
Oh, yeah.
you know, all the wrong notes that are going to appear in it, however long a contemporary opera is, you're going to find them. And yeah, or there's going to be moments when you can ring up or email the composer and say, "Do you really mean this?" And they can say, "Yes, I do, actually."
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. I mean, that sounds.
Or do you I see that you wrote pizzicato. Can we try it spiccato? Because here's how it sounds.
Yes.
And it's like, wow, that actually sounds pretty cool. Yeah, let's do spiccato. And so it becomes this collaborative thing that you can share in a lab, in an audible laboratory scenario that happens like weeks and months before anybody gets to a rehearsal room, and wastes a musician's time actually doing that,
Yeah. Well, that's brilliant. Do not have the technical chops to do that, and I doff my cap in your general direction for doing it. But I think for contemporary music, especially opera, I think that's a wonderful thing. If you be able to do that, and then you arrive ready, I think that's great. Are you fascinated by conductors and conducting? And would you like to learn a lot more about what we do and how we do it? Well, you can find out all sorts of secrets, tips, opinions, and much more on my Patreon page. You can hear over 17 hours of interviews with musicians, composers, soloists, and managers, and hear their thoughts on conducting and conductors. You can listen to 17 bonus mini-episodes that accompany this podcast. You can read articles I've written on conducting and conductors, and you can even have conducting lessons from myself. All of this is available at patreon.com/a mic on the podium, and from just £5 a month, which is less than a pint of beer in most cities across the world, you can gain access to this ever-growing resource on conductors and conducting. Details and links to the page are in the show notes attached to this episode. Now, the all-important 10 questions with my guest, Kwamé Ryan. Kwamé, it's that time when we must traverse the 10 questions. And I always start with, what sound or noise do you love, and what sound or noise do you hate?
I really enjoy the sound of any moving vehicle, be it a car, a bus, a plane, or even a starship, if I'm watching Star Trek or Star Wars. I love that hum.
Yeah.
I find it very comforting. What sound do I hate? I detest the sound. I can hardly even say the words. I detest the sound of fingernails on a chalkboard.
Yeah, it's that one, or a knife or a fork scraping across a porcelain plate is another one. Yeah, sorry.
Stop.
That worked, dear listener. I wish you could see Kwame's face, but it worked. We know he doesn't. We know he wasn't making that up. There we go.
No.
If you had 24 hours free, what would you spend it doing?
I would spend half of it walking or riding my bike in the forest, and half of it watching rugby.
Ooh, rugby union.
Rugby union. I used to play it as a boy at school, and have never. It's never let me go as a pastime. Love it.
I used to enjoy playing it as a schoolboy until my fingers on my left hand basically got too precious by playing the violin, and so I had to give it up, and I stuck to cricket instead. And look where that got me: broken fingers and a broken jaw. So that didn't work either.
Oh dear! I gave it up because I got knocked out actually during a rugby match, and ended up in hospital, and never played again after that.
But yeah, wonderful to watch. Now, I wonder whether your favourite conductor of Yesteryear will also be wonderful to watch. Have you got one, or have you got more than one?
I think I only really have one conductor of Yesteryear, in the sense that they're not alive anymore, that I feel strongly about or follow in some way from a point of view of principle, and that's actually Arturo Toscanini. I love his sort of clear-cut, no-nonsense approach to standard repertoire, and his notion of fidelity to score is something that I sort of was schooled in, I guess, as a contemporary music specialist originally. I apply that same principle to anything that I'm conducting. I'm always feeling like I'm the advocate of a composer who's living sort of vicariously through my performance of their work. So I really hold Toscanini for his fidelity to score high for that.
And there's such rhythm and drive, and I mean, it's funny, his name has not come up regularly. I mean, you know, Carlos Kleiber comes up once every 2 or 3 episodes, but Toscanini's not that regular a feature as the answer to this question, and I wonder why. I wonder whether it's a sound that some people don't like, or I don't know. But yeah, I really enjoy watching those Toscanini. You know, something like Force to Destiny, it's just got such drive and such panache about
exactly
it.
That was the first Toscanini that I saw. It was La Forza del Destino, and it blew me away. I totally agree with you.
Yeah. Well, I wonder whether your favorite current conductor or conductors also blow you away. Some people find this question difficult to answer. Some don't find it difficult at all. I wonder which camp you'll be in, Kwamé.
Well, you know, similar to my answer to the favorite conductor of Yesteryear, I'm not sort of a fan of any conductor for any particular performance, but I tend to approach this from a philosophy of conducting. My current favorite is René Jacobs, and I love René, I guess, because he brings such originality to his readings of pieces that you think you know, and it's a freedom that he allows himself that is underpinned with unbelievable research and study and understanding of context, and sort of history of the work he's doing, and the surprises that allows him to plate up for the audience's ears. I find just delightful, time and time again.
Well, it's a choice I've not heard before, but it's a choice I really agree with. As you can imagine, there have been so many different choices over the episodes, but I'm sure René Jacobs has not appeared, and he should have done before now. So bravo you for choosing him. Thank you. What is the hardest work you've ever conducted?
Well, obviously, with a background in contemporary music, I've had my share of athletic challenges.
When you're conducting a telephone number on every page. Yeah, I can imagine.
Exactly. I mean, I think probably the hardest technical challenge I've ever had in the theater was Matthias Pincher's first opera, L'Espace Dernier, which I did the world premiere of at the Bastille. It was written for 3 orchestras. And when we went into it, I thought it was going to be a situation. And of course, 2 of the orchestras are in the pit and 1 of them is on the stage. Yeah. And we thought, okay, this will work with monitors. And it ended up not being possible. And so the guy who was my assistant at the time ended up conducting the 3rd orchestra on the stage, connected via cameras and monitors to me. Yeah. He ended up having a really good career, a guy called Alejo Perez, who you may have actually interviewed, from a South American conductor. I think he may be Chilean. Anyway, that was an adventure. Let's put it that way.
I bet.
Emotionally, I think the hardest piece that I've done may have been the Matthew Passion. Just because Bach, like a number of other German composers, stirs me emotionally. And I haven't really put my finger on why, but I've had the experience of being in floods of tears at the end of the Matthew Passion more times than I'd like to admit to. That is, of course, a wonderful experience to bare your soul like that, but it can be a little bit challenging to be so emotional on the podium when you've got conducting business to do. But yeah, definitely, I'd say that's up there with the emotional challenges of conducting.
When traveling abroad to conduct, what item could you not leave home without?
Well, from a purely practical point of view, I absolutely must have contact lenses with me. The reason being that I am a sweater.
Okay. Yeah. You're speaking to another one.
Which means I have tried to hold it in. I have tried. I'm just apparently incapable of moving my arms without my sweat glands moving in sync. And so I end up, pretty wet when I'm conducting, not so much rehearsals as performances, which means that I'm incapable of wearing glasses to perform. It's just not possible. So I have to have a set of contacts in my eyes and a spare set of contacts nearby if it's an opera, and probably another set up in my dressing room just in case, because contacts are so key to being able to see anything in the pit for light bending purposes, but also for sweat purposes.
See, now, I mean, the sweating is an important thing. I mean, my eyes are getting worse and worse now at the age of 51. My arms are suddenly not long enough to hold the piece of paper away or the score. I've had a few recently where I've asked an orchestra to go from a bar number we haven't even got to yet because I've read the bar number wrong. It is. I remember playing when I wore glasses to play the violin. I remember, sweat running down the front. There's nothing worse when you're playing. When you're conducting, you need your vision perfect. So, a wonderful answer. And again, I don't think I've had that answer before. So, yeah, brilliant. What is the one thing you would change about being a conductor?
If you allow me, I will tell you what I would change about becoming a conductor rather than being a conductor.
Of course, yeah.
I wish, and I'd hope that I'll be able to do my part to make this so, that young conductors were not dumped in the deep end of conducting before they understood what was actually required of them in the role of conductor. You demonstrate some technical prowess, you demonstrate good ears, and many people will tell you, oh, you should be a conductor. And then you start doing it. And while you're doing it under high pressure, if you have the fortune to be successful early on, while you're doing it, you realize, oh, this is mostly not about having good technique and having good ears. There's so much more that goes into this, starting with understanding people and understanding how you go through the thoughts, beliefs, desires of another artist or another group of artists to get to a common result. That's something that certainly in my experience was never spoken about in a conducting class. You'd be told, if you beat like this, you'll get this. You do an upbeat like this, you'll get this result. But the psychology of conducting, the sort of dark or even light art, the bright art of psychology that goes through being in a community of artists for a time with people and getting to a common result as a community, that's hardly ever spoken about. So I wish that becoming a conductor was something that young conductors were led into in a more thorough fashion that deals with more than just technique and oral skills.
I think in the current world, the best way to achieve that is to become an assistant for 2 years somewhere and to learn it from watching not only the music director of an orchestra, but watching each guest that comes in for each project. And that can be a Friday night, light music, West End and Broadway music songs, and it's a different conductor, to somebody who does a family concert on a Sunday, to somebody who's then in for 4 days doing, Mahler 4, to their music director, and seeing different people's approaches, and then in between all of that, you go and stand in a coffee queue and you discover why that conductor has just suddenly put the backs up of the orchestra, and it could be over one sentence. And I think that's the only way that at the moment that a conductor can gain all of that without having been a professional player like myself, because I do worry, and it's come up on the podcast before, about people who win competitions and then suddenly they've won a competition. A lot of it must be based on their stick technique, but then they get 30 engagements with 30 different orchestras around the world they've got to do in the next 5 years, and they're thrust in front of these people. And I don't get how many times people say, or say to them, you're not a conductor yet. By winning that competition, they must think, well, I'm to a degree, and now I've got an agent, and now I've got 30 gigs, and now I'm doing this. And that's going to be a harsh learning curve unless you're very careful. So the best way is to become an assistant and take the slow train. Learn as much as you can from the people who've been playing in orchestras and doing it for years. I mean, I agree with you. I think it's so important.
Yeah.
Because you can be a whiz kid all you like, but if the next thing that comes out of your mouth after you stop is something an orchestra is going to take umbrage to or find upsetting, you ain't going to get any more work, are you? It's
exactly that. And of course, continuing to work, if you've bypassed the slow route, which you're talking about, is the only way to keep learning. So if it's aborted because you don't know what to say when you put the stick down, or you don't know not to say anything when you put the stick down, then a promising career can really be interrupted. So yes, I agree with you about the slow route. It's also true that the sort of berths to take that route are few and far between.
Yes, they are.
And so I would like to see, and again, I'm trying to contribute to this when I get invited to teach conducting classes or do master classes. I'd like to see this become a more fundamental part of a conductor's training, so that it's at least being broached. While stick technique and oral skills are also being drilled.
It's funny because having spoken to Marion Alsop and also Alice Farnham, both of which are involved in female conducting in particular, and they both talked to me about the language that they use and also body language that they use being slightly different or needing to be slightly different to a male conductor. But nobody talks about it for male conductors. Very, very, very rarely indeed. When I've dealt with some students at the conservatoire, occasionally I'll stop them and say, please don't use those words. Try this vocabulary or try that, so some other way of spinning the words around to make it positive, But it's funny, isn't it? That it's just not taught. That the psychology, the use of language, even things like humor, even things like rehearsal orders. I was chatting to some people with the London Philharmonic yesterday. I was working with them and we were talking about, conductors who come in and the rehearsal order. I said, well, the most important thing is try not to upset anybody, because you don't know whether they're the chairman of the board. And they're going to be deciding whether you're going to go back or not. If you suddenly decided to, that the piccolo player is going to play at 10:15 for 5 minutes and then see you at 4 o'clock just before the end, that could be the end of your relationship with that orchestra. So there's so many things that aren't taught. Really good answer. Thank you. Number 9 is another real or fantasy question, Kwame, and it is, what profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
What a good question. Well, one of the things that I've done, and I've tried a lot of things in my life. I actually have a podcast, the first episode of which is called Curiosity Stream, and it talks about the fact that I've allowed curiosity to drive through my life and sort of wash me up on a variety of different shores. And one of the things that I trained to do alongside being a conductor was actually being an Ayurveda consultant. So there was a point in my career where I was very active. I was very busy and feeling the stress of a busy conducting life. And so sort of typical me, instead of just taking yoga classes, I became a yoga teacher. And I was sort of bitten by the bug of that. And so instead of, taking an Ayurveda class. I trained to become an Ayurveda consultant and actually did it. And but these are things that I've learned and only used for myself. And one of the things that I'd like to do moving forward would be to share the benefit that I've gained out of yoga and Ayurveda as a performing artist, as a conductor in particular, but more generally as a performing artist, because I think that it could help a lot more people than one might imagine. For the simple reason that it's based on your constitution. It takes account of how you're made up physically and psychologically, and then makes recommendations in a sort of scientific fashion for how you can live your life and do your work more happily and more healthily.
That's brilliant. Fascinating. I am going to do what I really ought to do with another podcaster is I'll make sure, dear listener, that the link to Kwame's podcast is in the show notes below, and then you can go across and hear about your curiosities. You said it. Is that episode 1, or is the whole podcast about that? It starts there and goes off in other directions.
The whole podcast is. It does. The whole podcast is called 8-Minute Idea, because I can get really intensely engrossed in a subject matter, but once I've talked about it for 8 minutes, I'm pretty much done. So I call it 8-Minute Idea, and it then doesn't demand too much of the listener. So each episode is not much longer than 8 minutes, or even under 8 minutes. And the first one's called Curiosity Stream, and gives the sort of starting point for this exploration of a whole myriad of other topics that I go into on the podcast.
Well, it'll be in the show notes below, dear listener, and I shall be tuning in myself. So there we go. And finally, Kwamé, if the world was to end tonight, what would be your choice of final meal and drink?
Okay, I like this question because I love to eat. So
me too.
Part of my studies to become a yoga teacher and to become an Ayurveda consultant have involved giving up meat. I did it voluntarily. I did it really for sort of for the love of animals, really. I just love animals, like alive animals. And so I became a vegetarian, and then I became a vegan. And then I found that I couldn't actually do without cheese in life. So I gave up veganism, came back to vegetarianism. And I've been a vegetarian for a decade and more. But one of the things that has not let me go is the taste of a burger.
Yes.
So if the world were ending, I'm happy to say that the discovery of the Beyond Meat burger has kind of revolutionized my life. It's allowed me to have a burger and fries with mayonnaise and a lactose-free milkshake without actually eating an animal. And that combination is what I would order if the world were ending tonight. And just talking about it, I might have to go out and find one and have it tonight, even though the world is not ending.
No. Well, it's the problem with this question, Kwamé, is that most people, I'd start talking about food, and right here, right now, dear listeners, 6:30 in the evening, so it's coming up to dinner time, and you've just made my stomach rumble talking about burgers and fries and milkshakes. I love milkshakes. So thank you. And thank you for a wonderful hour chatting. It's been an absolute joy, really fascinating, wonderful time chatting to you. And I hope we could, I might have the meat version. I'll let you have your Beyond Meat version. We can meet over a burger and fries and carry on chatting another day. Thank you, Kwamé.
With pleasure, Michael. It's been really, really fun. Thank you for having me.
A Mic on the Podium was devised and produced by Michael Seal, with music by Ben Dawson. Next time, I chat with a British conductor whose career has really grown over the last few years. He studied with Sir Roger Norrington and has specialised in historically informed performance, while also becoming an expert in conducting orchestras live to film in concert. But until then, bye-bye.